Buddha's The Mirror of Truth a while ago, and I must admit I slightly thought, oh, that, you know, I just really like the phrase. It sort of yeah, I just really like the phrase, and I thought, oh, that would be a great title for a retreat or something. So here we are on our retreat entitled The Mirror of Truth. This teaching is actually a teaching that the Buddha gave to Ananda, and it comes from the Parinibbhana Sutta, which most of you, I know, will be very familiar with. But for those of you who aren't, it's the story of the last year of the Buddha's life, and the Buddha goes on a kind of last journey. He goes on his a kind of last journey around northern India with Ananda, and everywhere he stops, he would give a teaching, he would give a talk, and he would kind of reiterate some aspect of his teachings, that he'd kind of given over the last 40 years or so. And I think we'll probably have the reading tonight, actually, from the Parinibbhana Sutta and the Pali Canon. But actually, I was going to give an alternative version of this teaching that comes from Vishvapani's book, Gautama the Buddha, where he describes the teachings in the following way. Oh, lovely, thanks, Devanaga. So he says, travelling on to Nadika, he found himself besieged once again by questions about the fate of the recently deceased. Gautama's comments to Ananda, who had passed on the requests, are telling. That human beings should die is not out of the ordinary. But if you are going to come to ask the Tathagata and ask him this question every time someone should die, that will be a nuisance. He tells Ananda, with surely more than a little irony, of a powerful method for telling someone's rebirth, called the Mirror of Truth. If someone had unwavering faith in the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, and exhibited virtues that were praised by the discerning, untarnished and conducive to concentration, they would have a good rebirth or even find awakening after death. And if they didn't, well, they would have a worse one. There was no need to consult someone with special powers to know your future fate. You just need to observe your behavior, consider its likely consequences, and draw your own conclusions. So, thank you for that. So, yes, that's quite telling, isn't it? So the Buddha says, there's no need to consult someone with special powers to know your future fate. You just need to observe your behavior, consider its likely consequences, and draw your own conclusions. Yeah. So actually, the Buddha here is he's responding to questions about people's fate in their next life, actually. But really, of course, this teaching applies equally well to our fate in this life. You know, what the Buddha is actually saying is that we need to take responsibility. We need to take responsibility for our own life. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of responsibility, and drawing on Sangharakshita's teaching of about the individual, or the true individual, as he calls it. And there's just some really interesting aspects, I think, of Bante's teaching around the true individual that I think are interesting and worth kind of worth exploring in a bit more detail. And in a way, he highlights some of the difficulties or some of the kind of challenges that face us in being a kind of true individual. But just before I go on to that, there was just a couple of other aspects of what I thought I would pull out from that reading. So the Buddha is telling Ananda what the conditions for a favourable rebirth are. So firstly, he says that one must have unwavering faith in the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. And that is the first condition. So there's this aspect of faith, this aspect of us having faith in the three jewels and going for refuge to the three jewels. So there's that aspect around faith. And then secondly, the Buddha goes on to say that as well as faith, one needs to exhibit virtues that are praised by the discerning, untarnished, and conducive to concentration. So what I think he's talking about here is the importance of ethics. So he's really kind of reiterating the importance of ethics in our spiritual life. So it's only then, having talked about faith and ethics, that the Buddha goes on to say that if you practice with those two in mind, then you would have a good rebirth, or even find awakening after death. And then, of course, it concludes with the Buddha saying, all you need to do is observe your behaviour, consider its likely consequences, and then draw your own conclusions. And in a way, this seems really good news to me, because it is quite kind of simple, isn't it? You know, and there's also this sense that our destiny is in our own hands. And some of these themes, I think Sri Kirti is going to be exploring a little bit more tomorrow, particularly around faith and going for refuge, and possibly also stream entry, which good. Okay, so thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about responsibility and ethics. So what is the kind of crux of taking responsibility? And I think there's something for me about living in accordance with our own ideals. So that seems to me what the kind of fundamental aspect of sort of taking responsibility for ourselves is we have this kind of integrity, and we just kind of live. We kind of live in accordance with those ideals, and we kind of align ourselves with them. So our actions and indeed, of course, our thoughts and our words kind of are in harmony with those ideals. And of course, you know, this can be really difficult, can't it? Because you know, we all, well, I'm sure we all have very good ideals, and they may even be very noble. But of course, the challenge is to really live in accordance with those ideals. And I was just thinking that in a way, we could talk about the spiritual life being just about taking just taking more responsibility for ourselves and just living more in line with our kind of aspirations. And it's by taking this responsibility that we start to become, in Sangha-Achita's words, a true individual. Yeah, and as I say, I really like this teaching of Bante's, because it sort of it kind of hits the nail on the head in some ways. So I'm just going to say a little bit about his teaching of the true individual. So he talks about an individual being someone who wholeheartedly commits themselves to their individual development. So he kind of takes responsibility for himself, and also that he's free. So as an individual, we don't require the approval of other people. We require the approval of the group. Yeah, we're just kind of confident enough to act autonomously and make our own choices. And with responsibility, we make our own choices, and we're just able to accept the results of our own actions. So I think that's a kind of important aspect of responsibilities, that we take responsibilities for our actions, and we take on the kind of consequences of those actions. So Bante gave a talk. This was it was called "The Individual in the World Today," and it's a great talk. I'll put a link in the chat box, because it's on Free Buddhist Audio, and it was given in 1979, which, you know, it seems like an age ago, doesn't it? But actually, it's just very relevant. It still feels very, very relevant, sort of 40 plus years later. And Bante says, he says in this talk that the biggest human problem that the world faces, and he talks about it being bigger than the environment or economics, is the problem of the individual, or rather the problem of the group. So I'm going to say a little bit about Sangha-Achita's kind of idea of the group, and how that sits with the individual. I can see, thanks Devanaga, popping that link in the chat. So so part of the problem that Bante identifies is this idea of the group, and of course we all belong to many different groups, don't we, in our lives? Yeah, you know, we might be working, in family, sports teams we follow, politics, so, you know, interests, social media, you know, so we belong to all these kind of different groups in our lives. And Bante says, so this is what Bante says about groups. He talks about them, and perhaps when I'm talking about what Bante says about groups, you can just have in your mind perhaps some of the groups that you belong to. So he describes a group as being a collective organized for its own survival, in which the interests of the individual are subordinated to that of the collective. So I think the really important bit here is this point, that the interests of the individual are subordinated to that of the collective. And in simple terms, I take that to mean we do what others do. That's kind of part of being in the group. Yeah, and of course, and as Bhante points out, groups in many ways have served us well, haven't they? I mean, historically, we have them to thank for civilization and our prosperity. So yeah, so they do have their kind of upsides. But fundamentally, he points out that groups are like a power structure in which the kind of ultimate authority is force, and of course the price to pay for being in the group is conformity. Okay, and I think that this is the kind of crux, isn't it? Is that we belong to all sorts of groups, and that within the group there is this dynamic where those within the group act in a similar way, and we conform to the norms of those groups. So we live by the values of the group. Yeah. So and because the individual is a member of a group, he doesn't really think or act for himself. He just kind of acts as the other members of the group do. Yeah, and I love this is a great. I love this term that Bhante uses. He says this individual does not think independently, and he calls him like the statistical individual, which means like he can be counted as like a person, but he doesn't exist as an individual in the true sense. He's just a member of the group. I think this is great, isn't it? I had this sort of vision of all these sort of this whole row of kind of statistical individuals. Yeah, and it reminds me of. I was reminded sort of when I came back to look at this or listen to this talk of Bhante's. It reminded me of Brave New World. I don't know if anyone's read that, but it's this kind of dystopian. It's Aldous Huxley's kind of dystopian novel where everyone in society, there's this kind of great social engineering exercise, and everyone is kind of genetically modified to fit into a kind of particular group. So if you were put into a kind of group of don't know, people who were going to kind of dig roads or something, your brain would be kind of engineered genetically so that you kind of conformed with the kind of values of that group. Yeah, and of course there is a sort of there is an aspect, isn't there, that conformity in a way has a kind of comfort to it as well. And that yeah, I'm saying this because actually in Brave New World, everyone's given as many drugs as they like, because it kind of numbs them out, and it kind of puts them in, I guess, what we would call the kind of animal realm or something. And there is it just made me think that in a way being part of the group is quite comfortable, isn't it? We're not we're not challenged too much. And the binding to the group can be very strong indeed. So in this talk, Sangha talks about the caste system in India, where of course people well, I mean, people are bound to this group, not only in their present lifetime, but over many, many lifetimes. And it exerts an enormous influence on all aspects of someone's life, the job they do, relationships, where they live, kind of all aspects. And we can see, we can see this much closer to home, can't we? And politics is a good example, isn't it, of a group that that we belong to, and it can be really painful to see, can't it? In politics, particularly, if you followed the American election or something, that's such a good example, isn't it, of how people get kind of polarized into different groups, and also I think this aspect that people just don't have to think for themselves. So that they in a group you can just accept the values of the group, and again you see it with sort of I think in sort of sport as well, with football, don't you? Like if you're a football fan, if you're a fan of one team, you don't have to think about it at all. You're just told which teams you don't like, and that, and there's all these kind of dynamics that kind of play out. But of course, one of the things with the group is that it doesn't always behave very well, and we might often find ourselves in groups where or we might well find ourselves in a group whose values don't really reflect our own kind of ethical values. And I think interestingly, I mean, I think one of the reasons that we as humans perhaps get in a bit of a mess is because in a way we abdicate our own responsibility to the group. And I think if you look at the world, there's all sorts of things that happen that individuals alone, or that don't sit comfortably with individuals' own kind of values, but there's somehow this kind of process within groups where we give up our own kind of responsibility to the group, and then the group kind of makes decisions or kind of lives out values that aren't in line with our own. And I think you can particularly see that around sort of environmental issues, where collectively we behave in a way that we wouldn't individually. And I suppose in the past, in the West, the church would have been a very powerful group, wouldn't it? And that would have had a very powerful effect on how people live their lives. But in a way, I guess that's got replaced, and in a way, it's probably got replaced by the kind of consumerist society. And the whole kind of idea of materialism, and the sense that in a way we're all kind of part of that group, aren't we? And there's this kind of belief within this group that consuming is good. It's good to be a consumer. And of course this exerts a huge amount of influence, and it has this effect of imposing its values on us. And I think it's also probably a good example of where the more we immerse ourselves in a group, the more dependent we become on it, and the more we have to accept its values. And again, I think taking the kind of consumer society as a kind of example, it's hard for us to sort of disengage from that, isn't it? We're quite kind of, it's very easy to be quite involved with it. And in a way, it doesn't necessarily reflect our own values or the values of the Dharma. Yeah. So, yeah, I think I'll go on to say, oh yeah, so just one other point. And of course, in a way, one of the challenges of our kind of spiritual life is that the Sangha can become like a group, can't it? So yeah, it can be a group where we are kind of conforming to the values of the Sangha, rather than kind of acting as kind of true individuals, where we take responsibility for ourselves. And I'm not going to go into it now, but Bhante talked about what he called a third order of consciousness, which is like a collection of kind of true individuals. But, yeah. So so I'll say a bit about the true individual. So one of the responses that we tend to have when we belong to a group is this sort of response of well, there's nothing I can do, you know. I'm kind of yeah, I don't have any influence on the group. I'm just subject to the kind of actions and values of the group. So I'm kind of powerless, and I think that sense of powerlessness is quite kind of prevalent, isn't it? I think in the world, yeah. But with greater awareness, we just become more conscious, and we become, well, I guess we become more conscious of how our values and our actions may be misaligned. But I think we also become more conscious of our ability to think and feel and act for ourselves, and even to act against the group, which of course takes it takes a certain amount of courage, doesn't it? Yeah, it's much easier just to go along with the consensus. Yeah. So another kind of aspect of being a true individual is that we're prepared to act based on our own values, regardless of the consequences. So we just can have this faith that we are acting in accordance with our own values, and that those values are well intentioned, and then we don't have to worry so much. We don't have to worry so much about the consequences. And of course, one of the things we can notice is that there is this tension, isn't there? There's this tension in our kind of practice between conforming to the kind of group and trying to be a kind of individual, and they may be kind of pulling in different directions. And I think it's just interesting to notice where we feel that kind of pressure to conform in our lives, and where we do, where we kind of act in accordance with group values, and particularly around work. That can be an area. Sometimes, something like, if we work in a kind of office or something, or we work with other people, and quite often there's a lot of kind of pressure to get involved in kind of gossip and kind of things like that, and in a way sometimes it feels sometimes we want that sense of belonging as well, don't we? And sometimes we can kind of end up just getting sucked into those kind of values of the group and kind of acting in accordance with them. Yeah. So I just had a slide that I just thought was quite useful as perhaps as a way of distinguishing between the group and the true individual. So so we in the group we just accept the values of the group. We do what the group does, and we conform. And perhaps when we notice ourselves doing that, we can think of Bhante and the statistical individual. But when we, as we move towards becoming a true individual, we start to live by our own values, and we make our own choices. And it is part of this kind of commitment to our own kind of individual development. Thanks, Stephen. So I'm just going to say a little bit about how can we take responsibility, and there's obviously many sort of threads or strands within that we could look at, but I thought of a couple that I would just say a little bit about, and the first is just really just starting to understand and explore our own relationship with karma. And the Buddha, he talked about in the 5 reflections things that we should frequently reflect on, and these include old age, sickness, and death, as well as being parted from what we love. But it also includes, as the final reflection is that of karma. And I think we've got a slide that just has a quote from the Buddha. So this is what he said we should frequently reflect on. I am the owner of my actions, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related through my actions, and have my actions as my arbitrator. Whatever I do for good or for evil, to that will I fall heir. Thank you. Yeah, so I just think it's a useful reflection to think how fully we believe, how fully do we believe in the law of karma, and do we fully believe that all our actions and of course this is actions of speech and mind as well. Do we really believe that they will have consequences? And I think the other aspect of this is that as well as our kind of belief in karma, the other aspect to it is, are we sufficiently aware of what we are doing? as we are doing it, to be aware of the kind of consequences. And I think that that's the other kind of critical aspect, isn't there? There's this aspect of believing in karma, but there's also this aspect of, do we have sufficient awareness to, on a kind of moment by moment basis, just be sufficiently aware of what we are doing, and then, of course, aware of its consequences. But I mean, we know at some level very deeply that the law of karma, don't we? And as the Dhammapada tells us, that if one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. Which, yes, it's such a beautiful line, isn't it? Happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. So, thank you. Yeah, and I sometimes, I sometimes think about my own kind of relationship with the law of karma, and why is it more difficult? Why is it more difficult to believe than, say, the law of gravity or something? I mean, we have no doubts, do we, about gravity? We wouldn't pick something up and leave it in midair and expect it to kind of stay there. But somehow, I'm not sure I've quite got that same relationship with karma. Yeah, and I think there's also this aspect in terms of responsibility of just seeing how our actions shape our mind, and in quite a powerful way, particularly when we kind of repeatedly, just those kind of repeated sort of thought patterns, habitual thought patterns that we have. And perhaps the other aspect of around kind of responsibility and karma is just, what do we choose not to see? What actions do we take and decide, to kind of ignore the consequences of it? And I was thinking, I mentioned gossip earlier, but quite often we might just think that's harmless. And sometimes I think it's a good test for something like that. How would the other person respond if they were there and heard what was being said? So I think there's quite often we might kind of it might be convenient not to see the consequences of our actions. And of course, taking responsibility can be quite painful, can't it? Because it kind of requires us to really look at the consequences of what we've done, and that can be painful. That sort of feeling of, did I really do that? And of course, we are very conditioned, aren't we? So much of what we do is a function of our past conditioning. So there's also this aspect of learning to work and understand, learning to work with our kind of past conditioning. I came across this lovely quote very recently. It's not from a Buddhist, but the quote is, "We are gripped by a cluster of our own history," and I just really kind of like that. Just this idea that we're really in the grip of our kind of our kind of our past actions and our past our past conditioning. And again, the last thing I'd just say on sort of karma and responsibility is just something I think about starting to notice, just starting to notice a bit more what our experience is. You know, what does our experience tell us? Do we see the results of our own actions in our life? And we can just do this in quite a kind of gentle way, can't we? I mean, we can just start, you know, it's just about noticing that when we act, you know, kindly or generously, just seeing how just seeing the effect of that. And the effects of it can be quite, I mean, some of the effects are quite obvious, but actually the effects of it can be kind of quite subtle as well, can't they? And I think there's just something about starting to just sort of tune in a little bit more and noticing our experience. Okay. I'm conscious that I've talked a lot, but I'm just going to say a little. I just wanted to say a little bit about ethics, just for a few moments. So at the beginning, I talked about a couple of the kind of conditions that the Buddha talked about for having a good kind of rebirth, but a couple of kind of conditions around around this kind of idea of responsibility and our own fate. And one of them was faith, which Shukurti is going to talk about tomorrow, and the other one was ethics. So the Buddha taught. He says in this teaching that one of the conditions is that one has exhibited values that were praised by the discerning, untarnished, and conducive to concentration. Yeah. And I think there's a kind of link here with faith that we can just start to have faith that if we act ethically, then the consequences of our actions will be positive. And this goes back to that previous quote from the Buddha about the 5 reflections. How we are born of our actions and heir of our own actions. And Bhante talked about this in terms of the true individual. So how the true individual takes full responsibility for their actions and the effects of their actions on the world. So they are living in accordance with their own, with the law of karma. Yeah. So I just one aspect of ethics that I wanted just to say a couple of things about it was is the importance of the imagination in ethics, and you may be familiar with this quote. It's a quote from Shelley, the poet, which is one of my favourite quotes. And he said. The great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our own nature, and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful, which exists in thought, action, or person, not our own. So there's something in this. Thanks, Devanaga. There's something in this about that identification and that ability to identify with others. So ethics requires this ability to imaginatively identify with others, and to be able to put ourselves and our own concerns aside. And it requires imagination to really be able to act with empathy, actually, by being able to share someone else's feelings or experience, by imagining what it would be like to be that person. And of course, you know, this is what we're trying to do with in the Metta Bhavana, isn't it? In the other Brahma Viharas, we're trying to cultivate that ability to kind of imaginatively identify with other people. Yeah, and I'm just in terms of ethics, I just wanted to read this quote, actually, that I came across recently, and it just really seemed to kind of capture something about the importance of being able to imaginatively identify with others, and the consequences of when we're not able to do that. And this quote is in a book that I read recently by a chap called Norman Fisher, who is a Zen chap. He's an American guy, and he says that he was talking about a friend, and he said, "The notion had large existential and religious implications for my friend. The story goes that he had developed his philosophy after an encounter he had early in his academic career. He was approached one day in his study by a disturbed student who wanted to discuss his personal problems with the already esteemed professor. Not wanting to be impolite, but still preoccupied by his studies, he heard the young man out, but without giving him much attention. Later that day, the man committed suicide, and for the rest of his life, the professor remained convinced that if only he had listened and met the man more fully, he would have saved his life. This is why he regarded the practice of meeting the other completely and sympathetically as the primary practice in living and the primary fact of life." Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, that I was just really taken when I read that, how you know, that just he had missed that opportunity, hadn't he? It's like we get caught up in ourselves and our own needs and our own priorities, and we just miss that opportunity to kind of connect and be present with others. And I really like that sort of closing line on that, where he says that the practice of meeting others completely and sympathetically is the primary practice in living and the primary fact of life. And it just kind of, it just kind of demonstrates, doesn't it, that sort of sense of interconnectivity. And again, I think it's a really useful practice, just to note. I mean, I notice it a lot at work, where, you know, I'm very busy, and you know, I can either be there with all my kind of needs and priorities in my mind, or I can kind of put those aside and just have that sense of being present with someone else. And it's kind of like a recognition of life, isn't it? because in a way, it's just a recognition of the fact that life is about kind of connection. Okay. So I'm conscious that there was a lot to that talk. Yeah, but we'll perhaps have a break, and we'll come back in 10 minutes or so and go into our groups. And thank you for listening.